Okay, so we're starting. Cool. Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Talya and I work for Wix. And I'm going to be talking to you today about our A/B testing system, which we actually use every single day to experiment on production. This is the third version that we've built, which means that we've basically taken all of the lessons we learned from the first 2 times. And it's been running for about 4 years now, so we've incorporated a lot of best practices in it. And let's start this by discussing the last time that you deployed a new feature to production. Okay, so you've hopefully written tests, you've done TDD, you think everything is going to be okay, and then you deploy. And now the question is, how do you know if everything is okay? So, you probably have logs and metrics and some monitoring system, and that will probably cover you for the biggest failures possible. So hopefully you know that you have not you don't have a big error rate, you have not seriously harmed the response time, for example. But what about everything else that you cannot anticipate? And this could be maybe some unexpected dependencies, like maybe you don't have a bug, but some other service down the line that is relying on your data is suddenly broken. And maybe you've just made a change that product-wise is not good, that your users do not like, and that makes them buy less or do whatever it is less that you want of. And the answer as always is, we test it. Okay, that was just my screen. So we test it like we test everything, but we want to test it on production. And the immediate question that comes up from this discussion is, okay, so do we test everything? And before I give you my obvious answer, I will give you one of our failure stories, okay? One of the times where we did not test something and it backfired. So one quick introduction to what we do at Wix. We basically have a platform that allows people to build their own website, okay? So this is our main product. A user goes in, they have this what you see is what you get editor, where you can drag and drop and edit things and add cool components, and then you have a site. And the basic funnel that a user goes through is usually this. So they come via some ad or a Google search or something, and then they see first this template page where they can see a collection of theoretical sites. They choose one, then they reach this editor page, they start dragging the components, they build something they like, and then they click the publish button, okay? Now we have a freemium model, so at this point you have an online site, it's actually running, you can send it, you can get feedback from your friends, and they tell you, yay, it's an awesome site, job well done. And at some point later down the line, you will upgrade your account. That's the premium part of the freemium. And when you upgrade your site, basically you can get a bunch of cool stuff, like for example your own domain without Wix's name in it, and no ads, and more cool things. And you will see in this screen that the upgrade happens in a completely different part, right? This is the editor, and this is some part where you much later on manage your account. And at some point a few years ago, one of our product managers said, the upgrade thing is hidden, it's quite down the line. Let's help users who want to buy earlier do this, okay? So they put this tiny button on the top, nothing dramatic, and they waited for the, for the premium accounts to start coming in. And I can see by your smiles that it's obvious that this is, I'm telling you the story because the opposite happened, right? So like conversion was hurt, we got less premium accounts bought, and there were two big lessons that we learned from this. So one is intent matters a lot, okay? Like the intent of the user at this point is probably not to pay us anything at all, not to buy anything, right? They're just playing around with the product, they want to see if it's cool, they want to send a link to a friend. They're not thinking about paying money, and just seeing the fact that they will maybe need to pay money it wasn't the right place to put it in. And the second lesson, of course, was yes, we need to test everything, okay? Because just as we developers always sometimes end up writing bugs, sometimes product managers have ideas that are not correct, and it's okay, it's a part of life. So one quick word about me before we continue. I've been working at Wix for 4.5 years now. Currently, I'm rotating with mentoring different teams, mostly around the areas of TDD and clean code. And I have been working on and off for most of this time on the system, which we call Petri, because it's like a Petri dish. It's where you grow things in weird ways. And also, one of the recent things I've been doing is working on open source in this code, and we will also soon be releasing this as a service available in the cloud to everyone. The announcement will happen sometime later. So, quick show of hands before I continue. Who here has some form of feature toggles or flags that they are using today in production? Okay, not a few, that's good. Keep your hands up for a second. How many of you also use this for some form of A/B testing? Okay, so some hands stayed up, most went down. I don't think that's very surprising because it's more complex. And before I discuss with you everything you want from an A/B testing system, let me go back one step, okay? So we have feature toggles, we have A/B tests. These are two categories of things which implementation-wise can be very similar, and we use the same experimentation system for them, but they have two very different concepts. So A/B tests basically mean you're dividing your users into two groups, okay? There's A, there's B, and then you want to measure them and see if B is better than A. Feature toggles usually mean that you're not measuring anything, but you want this ability to shut down things, which is really awesome. And the reason that we like shutting down things is because we like sleeping at night, okay? And this is something I remembered yesterday and I added to my slides because it made me so happy when it happened. So one of the small startups that Wix bought a few months ago, so it took them a bit of time, and one of the things they were, supposed to do at the beginning was to integrate with our things, and one of these things was Petri, our experiment system. And I come into work one day and I open it should have been on Slack, but never mind. And I see this message, and it says, Petri is amazing. Okay, what happened? And basically, the guy is telling me, we deployed something and something went wrong, and we took the feature toggle down and everything was okay. And then I told him, yes, I like calling Petri a sleep system for developers, and he kind of appreciated the reference. So that's one big part of it. And the other big part, which I will be concentrating on for most of the lecture today, is the A/B testing part, okay? Because it's more complex and it builds on top of the feature toggles. And we will be discussing three major things, okay? One is, what does it actually mean to conduct an experiment? The second is the life cycle, like what happens when you decide if it's a good experiment, if it's a bad experiment. And the third part is, all of the weird things we discovered, things you should try not to fall into once you start moving into the space. And just to make sure that we are all aligned. So let's discuss the most classical A/B test, the marketing type. This used to be our homepage, okay? We have this amazing page. You can see the templates thing I discussed before. And then a product manager comes along and says, you know what, I think this page will bring in more traffic. Okay, so, someone makes the nice landing page, and then we need to decide somehow if it's really a better thing or not. So we have all of this traffic coming in, right? And the control group, we call this control group and test group. It sounds kind of like a lab experiment, which is on purpose. So we have all of the control group, which is all of the users that are seeing the old homepage. And then we start gradually introducing users to the B option, okay? We will call them the test group. And at some point, we are going to have to decide if the B option is better. Now, what does better mean? It depends on your product, right? So the picture that I described before of our funnel, a user goes to the template page and edits the site and publishes the site and then buys an account. That's our own funnel. The KPI, which is key performance indicator, is in our case buying the premium account, but it could be anything that makes sense for whatever it is you're testing. So it could be, number of seconds spent on the page, clicks on a button, anything that makes sense for whatever your product is doing. And at the end of the day, some business analyst is going to be looking at some kind of graph and saying if it affected conversion, this KPI, in a good way or a bad way. This graph is a graph of a very non-successful experiment, okay? But the point is that you're going to have to look at some data at the end in order to make the decision. Another important thing is, as your system goes, as you have more users, more traffic, more A/B tests, then the measurable effect of each one is going to be, smaller and smaller. So we change our terminology and we say we don't need B to win, but we need it to not lose, which means we need it to not badly affect the KPI. And the second part of this thing, you know, like we have this graph. It's basically a statistical equation. And as with all statistical equations, we need it to be significant, like 95% confidence level in something, which means you need to be aware of the numbers you have, okay? So like we have 100 million registered users. The homepage has an order of magnitude more. I do not remember the number of visits that we need for this to be significant, but I can tell you one thing for sure. The analysts know this off by heart. This is what you need to be aware of. Okay, so we've decided there's A, there's B, we're measuring the numbers, we have good statistics people who know their math and they can decide if things are good or not. And then we need to split, you know, we need to split our users and start measuring them. So one very intuitive and simple way to split this would be to just, you know, separate them into two equal groups and measure them. And this is obviously not the best way to go about things, okay? Because things happen. We can write bugs, we can have unexpected dependencies, and I would remind you that the whole reason that we started doing A/B testing to begin with was because, you know, sometimes things don't go well. And when things don't go well, you want to, you know, have the minimal effect possible before you fix them, which is what we call gradual exposure. So we start off with a smaller percentage than 50. It depends on the traffic of your product, right? If you have huge amount of traffic, it could be 1%, it could be 25. If you choose 1%, it will take longer to get to significance, okay? This is something that you can play around with, and it depends on how eager your product manager is to get feedback or not. And then we gradually add more and more percentages, okay? So once we get to 50 and it's determined successful, we can just go over to 100. There's no reason to open it to more than 50% for measuring. And there's one more question that this raises, okay? So we said 50% or 25% of what? Of all users? So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that we have like this set of filters that we can use and people can like dynamically decide to add to experiments, and it's basically based on anything that we know about our users. Okay, so it could be the language, the country they're using, the user agent of their device. We sometimes open experiments only for our own company employees to begin with to gather feedback before the product is completely baked, for example. And we have all of these things that we can combine with a percentage. So this is how we conduct an experiment, okay? And now I need to take you through the whole life cycle of this thing because it sounds easy. I'm saying, yeah, you know, we'll split the traffic A, B, but how does this happen, okay? Like there are quite a few people involved in this thing that need to do something. So the first important thing to understand is that there are a few people involved, okay? So this will start with your analyst or product manager, depending on your, you know, role definition. And it will start with someone saying, hey, I have an idea. This B thing I'm saying that this is, you know, a better product. And then someone has to sit down and code this thing, right? At the end of the day, there's going to be like if A, if B, do something else. This someone is usually us, the developers. And even after this happens, someone has to be in charge of the gradual exposure, right? Like someone needs to decide that we have collected enough data, we know that we have not harmed our business and that we can add more percentage or more languages and so on. And at the end of all of this, we also have to merge the experiment somehow because we don't want our code to have if else, like if A or B in it forever. So I'm going back again to the beginning of this timeline, okay? So the developer sits down with the product manager and says, okay, so A means this to you, B means this to you, and then we insert this line of code, okay? This specific line of code can be found in many places. This is also what the open source API exposes. And you will notice that it's a very concise API, okay? So we say laboratory, because we're doing experiments, conduct an experiment called homepage, okay? Homepage because this is my example. And we have if the result is template 1, else probably template 2, and then we need the code to behave differently. The next stage will be in the UI, okay? This is a screenshot. Basically, the important thing here is that when a product manager is opening an experiment, they have this drop-down list. It contains only experiments that actually live in our code, that will, that actually have an effect. And this is a classical example of starting off with 20% of the new behavior. We also have the ability to add filters and stuff, but I've only shown the basic part of the UI. And then, at some point, someone has to get this graph, okay, and measure the conversion for A, the conversion for B, and say, yes, this is 1. I'm talking about the happy path now, okay? I'll get to the not so happy path in a minute. So we say the experiment is 1, and then we move it to be a feature toggle, which basically means no filters, open to everyone. And at some point, maybe, maybe the day after, maybe the month after, it depends on us, then we can merge the code. So we can stop doing this if part, and we can just keep the else, okay? Because we've decided that it's 1. So we have some point, the original point before this experiment probably only had this thing, right? The do something is the old behavior. While the experiment is running, we have maybe this, and then at some point we need to decide which one of them is going to survive. So our code is constantly evolving with this thing. Okay, and this is a reminder, because I said feature toggle, and I think this is a good place for me to remind that feature toggle means we're not measuring anything anymore, okay? We've decided something is better. We're not merging the code at that moment because maybe we want some more time with the ability to just kill the switch, maybe we don't. But this is one phase that we go through. So, okay, so we've discussed what it means to have an A/B test, how we measure it, how we actually expand it until we decide that it's 1. And now is the part where I discuss where things get messy, because they get messy, okay? And the first most important lesson I think that we should think about is the notion of consistency of user experience. Try to imagine a time when you kind of had the feeling that someone was running an A/B test on you. I think you will all find an example. Okay, so you know that moment where you go into your Google inbox and everything is just like in different places? And you're annoyed because you're used to doing things in one click. And then you look at your colleague's screen and everything is normal. So you've been A/B tested, okay? Like this happens all the time. And this feeling you have of, someone's moved my cheese it's a normal thing, okay? We're human beings. Which means that we need to realize that there are different types of users, okay? And users that have not yet used this part of your product or have never visited your site are what we call untainted users. They're users with no previous experience or notion of what is good. And therefore, usually you want to start testing on these people because they will give you better feedback of the usability. I'm saying usually because you can find different cases. It depends a lot on your product. And your product manager is usually the one who decides, by the way, if it's going to be open now to new users or to all of the users and so on. But it's a very important distinction. One very important type of users we also have, which we usually tend to forget about, is SEO traffic, okay? Bots. They're not actual users. They really don't like being A/B tested on, right? Like they will penalize you for it on purpose, by design. And even if you don't care about your SEO ranking, you don't want some option B which may end up dying, being indexed somewhere and being available to someone. So it's really important in general and by default not to A/B test on bots unless you decide you're actually doing something related to SEO. This may not be relevant for all products, but this is something I have to keep in mind because it's a very big pitfall. Okay. The second interesting thing about not all of the users being equal and about consistency is that you always want to, you really want to make sure that you are gradually exposing things, okay? And the reason for this is, again, the whole reason that we're doing A/B testing is because we make mistakes. So this is another example of a failed test that we had, okay? This is from a few years ago. Someone wrote the first version of our mobile renderer. Okay, so sites built on top of Wix, we also need to render them on mobile devices. And someone said, we have to build this product, and the first version was born. And it was not implemented very well. Okay, like the loading time was not good enough, people were not happy about it. And luckily, we had this A/B test, and it wasn't exposed to all of the sites, okay? So at least there were not many unhappy users. But what do you do when this happens? Why am I talking about this in the context of consistency? Because let's say you have a site, right? And you entered the experiment, and you clicked the button, or maybe it even happened automatically, and now you have a site, and it runs on mobile, and you've sent this link to your friends on WhatsApp. And now, what are we going to do? Make your site disappear on mobile? I don't know, like we need a minute to think about it, right? So we use this concept we have, which means it's called pause. And what it means is anyone who was already in the experiment will remain in it, but no one else can be included in it. This is like an opportunity for us to also pause ourselves, like without the hysteria of everyone seeing the experiment, and decide. And the decision can be actually very difficult if you think about it, because you have 3 big options and they all basically suck, okay? One is saying, you know, we'll just keep this compatibility for everyone who had it because we just can't afford to take it away. And then you have to maintain code that you don't want forever, more or less. And the other option is to somehow persuade these users to migrate to a better feature. You may be able to do it automatically, you may not. Most migrations also never end, so you end up with all of this old code. And the other option is just saying, you know what, it's not important enough, we won't support it. And you know, you can only do this so many times to a user, right? Like, so it should probably be a few times. And this is a product decision again. So while the experiment is paused, you and your product manager sit down and you discuss your options, which means it's really important to try and prepare for this in advance, right? Like if you try and think about what will happen if we are mistaken and this experiment is not correct, then usually it will be much easier to make this decision. Okay, so a very closely related concept to consistency is persistency, which basically, by that I mean that persistency is something you usually need to implement to achieve the consistency, okay? And once again, I'm talking about types of users, okay? This is what we're dealing with, users. So if you have a registered user, right, someone has logged in and they enter the username, the password, you know who they are. Usually you have this GUID somewhere in a database, which you use for identification. Now in this case, we can use this GUID and we can, you know, give some consistent result. We can even save it in the database if we want or not. But what do we do about anonymous users? People who come to our homepage or to the template page that we give that shows all of our capabilities. And the problem with this is that people, you know, people clear cookies, people change devices, multiple people in the same household use the same device and so on. And the answer is, we do the best we can, which is cookies, and that's, you know, this is the world, this is the internet, that's all we can do. Fun fact, the number that we have from our BI of how many users tend to use different devices by the time they log in and identifies the same one is roughly 13%. I don't know if that means anything general or not, but it's not negligible, it exists. So you need to be aware of all of these things. Okay, so another lesson. You're used to thinking of your production as, you know, maybe you have, I don't know, so you have 50 microservices and each one has a version. That's complex. But now every single one of these things has ifs and else's and branches and things, okay? So your production is suddenly this huge monster with many options, 2 to the power of n, okay? Now, look at how quickly the numbers go up. It's exponential. Who wants to guess how many A/B tests more or less we have in production at the moment in Wix? How many? 50? Okay, anyone wants to guess something else? 1. If it was 1, I wouldn't be here. Maybe 1 per product could happen sometimes, but not for the, you know, complexity of products that now is Wix on production. So the actual number is not even this, because I didn't update my slides. It's more like 600. I don't even know how, you know, my phone probably cannot calculate the number for this, but it's enormous. It's nothing that any person can hold in their head or manage. Which means we had to adapt to this and consider the complexity, okay? So one question that keeps coming up is, don't all of these experiments affect each other? Now, it's a good question. The answer is, one, we randomize the results of experiments, and we randomize them by the user, but also by the experiment, okay? So if you've been conducted into option A in one experiment, it doesn't mean anything about the next experiment. You could get A or B completely independently of it. And the second part is that we try to use common sense, okay? So for example, an experiment in one product could affect some area. For example, in the editor, should we show the link to the upgrade button or not? And a different experiment in Wix could affect the way, I don't know, people view the checkout cart in our e-commerce solution. So if it's that separated, then it's pretty safe to assume that things do not affect each other. And if it's not separated as much, then yes, we need common sense, and we need people to not, do double experiments on the exact same area of the product. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we realized that we have to bake in some tools to allow people to deal with this complexity, okay? So we have support agents who sometimes need to understand what users are experiencing. We have developers who need to understand what they're seeing on the screen, Like, you don't even know which set of experiments you are in unless you go to the back office and start looking at each experiment. That doesn't make sense. So we have like an option for overriding something if you want to issue a request and say, I want this experiment or I don't want this experiment. And we have things baked into the actual product which support agents can tell users to run if we really need to. And the most important thing is that we have the near real-time BI tools, okay? So basically, if we go back to our, we have the system that shows us the events of users. Part of the data that we put on these events is the experiments that the user had at the time. So sometimes it's useful to understand what happened. So to recap, conducting an experiment is relatively easy, right? We have like if laboratory.conduct is A, else do something else. But the life cycle of it is something that you need to like pay attention to, and it's usually a few cycles of these things. So this is a very good point for me to stop and remind you that Petri is open source, okay? This means, A, that you can see the source code if you like. It happens to be implemented on the JVM, although we also have documentation on how you would deploy it if you don't have a JVM shop, which is, we also do this thing in Wix even, because most of our code is JVM, but it's starting to shift, and it's not exactly the case anymore. And another good thing is that we have, most of the things I've discussed today are documented there in depth, okay? So like the whole cookies discussion and consistency and what does new users mean, all of these things, it's there if you want to go and think more about these concepts. And the last thing I would like to leave you with is this. If you want to start going down this path, you can just do it, okay? I mean, you could go and read my documentation and you could deploy the system. You could also wait for me to have this available as a service. But you could also just go and implement a first feature toggle in your code, okay? Like, and this is something that doesn't take a lot of time. You don't need to persuade managers or the whole organization. And that screenshot I showed you of, someone saying, it's awesome, I just switched the feature toggle and went back to sleep. You can do that tomorrow. You don't really need that much. You don't have to do the whole complexity of filters and stuff. So it's really easy to get, to start rolling this thing. And at Wix, we use the system for A/B testing, but also for many other creative things, okay? So for example, sometimes we have sales that are targeted for a specific country, for their holiday, for only the specific week. And sometimes we have QA that's testing things on production instead of staging environments and all of this thing. And many of our features actually go through this cycle. I say internal testing because a classical life cycle of an experiment is we open it to no one. We use override parameters to just start seeing what's going on. Then we open it to our team by specific users. Then we open it to all of the company's employees. Then we open it to new users. And then we actually open it to everyone. So this is kind of, you can mix and match and take whichever parts of it that you want. How am I doing time-wise? Okay. It was a bit quicker than I was planning to. Which means I have a lot of time left for questions. 15 minutes, actually.
Hi,
Thank you.
I have a question. How do you usually do cleanup of your experiments in the code after when the experiment is finished, but you introduced some if statements to your code? How you usually clean up it?
Okay, so I should probably actually start with how do I introduce the if-else to begin with. And this is an actually very important part of this thing. So the original code just had this part in it, right? It was doing something. And we have tests for that, right? We do TDD, everything is tested. And now suddenly I need like these two bunches to coexist. So to begin with, I had to somehow change my tests and make them able to do both things. So one thing is that I provide a test kit for Petri so that people will easily be able to simulate this thing in their code. And then you are left with like two different test cases or test suites depending on how, how dramatic is the thing that you're trying to change. And when the time comes to merge this thing, you do the opposite, and like it's really fun because you can kill half of your tests or some abstract base class if that's what you've done. And one important thing to consider actually when you're doing this is this. So you have this if else, and then you've decided that it's successful. And you probably run in some environment with microservices and you're deploying with a click whenever you decide to do it. And at this point, what do you have? You have a service that is deployed with a version of if and else, and something that's open 100% to everyone. And now, you go and you merge this thing in your code. You don't have an if else anymore, right? What happens if someone rolls back your service for reasons that you don't even control? This happens, right? Like you can GA and you can roll back. So basically what you need to do is you need to keep the if-else in your code for at least 2 versions, because that's the only way you can be sure no one will ever roll you back. So it's actually a good question because it's you need to be aware of the whole environment you have of things going up and down and being GA'd forward or back.
Thank you. More questions?
Hi. How many bins we use?
How many what?
A, B, C, D.
Okay. That's also really nice. You know why? Because I've hidden the slides that discuss this. So let me actually address this. Okay, so what do you do when you have more than A and B? There are only 2 things I want to say about this. First of all, this is I don't know if you can see this here. Maybe if I do this. Okay. Statistically speaking, it's probably going to result in incorrect data, okay? Because of many various reasons that I don't want to explain, but whoever's doing the math or statistics in your company is probably well aware of, okay? So this is something called multivariant. Is the sound okay? Okay. So this is something called multivariant experiments. And there's a whole, mathematical discussion about what this means and how you should be comparing things to the combination of the other ones. What I can say is that we rarely do this thing, and when we do, the analysts have, their own methods of dealing with it. But this is what I usually recommend people to do in most cases. Okay, so if you really think you need to test many things, then test them in isolation and compare only 2 things at a time. So it might take you a bit more time to do it, but you will know that your data is correct. And actually, if you care about the math of this, you will easily find results in Google explaining all of the ways that big companies failed and discovered that they were using incorrect data. So not recommended unless you have someone who really knows what they're doing about this thing.
How much time do you need to have reliable results from A/B test? Week, 2 weeks, months?
Okay, so basically it's a factor of how much traffic you have hitting that if-else point, and how much significance you want to reach, and how much percentage you've opened, right? So one of the things we've actually introduced quite recently to our system is in the UI, okay, the place where the product manager actually expands the experiment. So we've introduced into this something that actually brings live data from our BI department that tells you, you know, if you're going to be open into 25%, this is the amount of time you will have to wait till you get the result. And this is based on the fact that they know how much traffic we have for each of our products at a given time. So the answer is, it depends on your numbers and how quickly you want to reach there. Basically, if you want to, if you want to have A/B tests, the very minimal requirement is that someone is measuring your KPI, your most important business indicator, because otherwise you won't be able to compare things. Like the minimal thing is you have the number of times users paid you, and then you can split them to A or B. Oh, does that answer the question? Okay. Cool.
I wonder, does the time frame matters when you try running this A/B testing? I mean, the results, let's say, in summer, and results of the same testing at the other period. Did you
results on the same? Could you repeat that?
Yeah, the same experiment A/B testing. Does results change with the time frame when you run it? I mean, for one period and for the other period, did you try to?
So you mean like on Sundays as opposed to other days of the week, for example?
Maybe not the days week. Maybe let's say the same A/B testing at the summer and the same A/B testing at the winter.
So I think the answer is it depends a lot on your general pattern of traffic and what your business is doing. Okay, because for example, in general, we can tell at our company that towards the end of the year there is a shift. Okay, people want to spend more money. Or during Christmas people are on vacation. And this is something in general that our marketing department is aware of, because when they compare the data, regardless of A/B tests, they need to be aware of this. And then the A/B testing is just one more layer in this, data-driven, number-driven business analysis thing. So I think the best way to think of it is that you have all of these BI events and someone is hopefully making sense of them, and A/B testing is one more layer of this thing, but you must understand what it is beneath it that you're testing to begin with.
Thanks.
Do you conduct A/B testing with different database schemas?
Could you maybe try to rephrase that, because I'm taking this to many different directions in my mind.
For example, you have the feature that works with database schema 1, and your developers change this feature, and the database changes.
Okay.
So do you conduct such kind of experiments?
So the answer is yes, definitely.
How do you manage it?
I think one of the biggest experiments I remember actually had a 3-state thing, but it was not A/B testing, it was just a feature toggle, which is why it made sense. And the names of the test groups were Mongo, MySQL, or a combination of both. Okay, and this was because we were migrating huge amounts of data from one database to the other. I think a few people here remember this. It actually, it succeeded, right? And then we ended up having another one because we changed to another schema. But the way we use it is, we said we have all sorts of filters, right? We can filter by specific user IDs. We also have a way of plugging into this and filtering by anything that is an ID, okay? So it could be a site or a instance of something we save in the site. And then we start very gradually. So, someone writes all of this amazing code that migrates things, and we need tests that verify all options. And then we open this on production for an actual site, but it could be my test site. And I run this and I figure out what has happened. And then I say, okay, it looks good, and then I open it for all company employees, because if I've made a mess, then at least, I have not harmed the business. And then we monitor all of the databases and the response times and lots of things, depending on, the bulk of the data you're migrating. And once you're confident enough and you've built monitoring tools that show you things and everything, then you can start opening it to, I think this is a good time to show the types of filters we have, because most of these are about different methods of gradual exposure. Okay? So for example, we have company employees I just discussed. Okay? I think that's obvious because if you're going to make an error, it should be here. But we also have, for example, this filter, which basically says this experiment will run for about 100 times or 1 million times or whatever, and then it will automatically pause itself. So once you've reached the stage where you're opening something so dangerous to users, you will usually do like 100, and then just wait and see and analyze your data, and then do 1 million, and then maybe open it to, you know, one country and then to 2 countries and so on. So we have like a very layered and configurable method here of these filters of deciding what to do.
And in this particular case with different databases, why did you locate this if statement? Is it somewhere on the load balancer or somewhere in the code of some of your products?
Okay, that's another good question. So one of the things that I call the system is a sleep system. Another way I sometimes like calling it, and it's only half a joke, is if else is a system. Why do I say this? Because it's very generic, okay? You have a piece of code, it's your logic, you need to test it. I'm not going to do any magic about that. To be more specific, the places where we use this in Wix are any code that's JVM, and then it actually looks like this. Any code that's on other stacks, like Node.js or directly from the client. So we have all of this thing exposed in a different server with a different API, which basically just gives you this. You can think of it as an API proxy thing. Nginx is one place where I think we're probably not ever going to touch with this mechanism. Although that's an interesting direction for some things.
Okay,
I'll see what our system people think about this.